Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Road to Freedom podcast. I'm Patrick Studebaker, and my co-host is Matt Martin. I just wanted to do a quick little update on you for this episode 3. We had originally decided to do the NAP for episode 2, but because we went a little long on the news stories and we didn't want to overburden people with a new podcast that ran so long, this is just the non-aggression principle discussion that Matt and I had. So from there, we're just going to get right into it without the normal introductions by ourselves. So that's what I'm doing here.
To the nap.
Naps are great.
Naps are great. And this nap is especially good, too, because you could take a nap, and if everyone in your house supports the NAP, then you'll be left unmolested from your nap.
Yep.
But there's something that I wanted to cover first as a precursor to the NAP. The NAP is this non-aggression principle that I'll just say that libertarians in general support the NAP as a foundational belief of their system of politics. And we'll get into the definition and the history of that a little bit. But first I wanted to talk about the worldview. I think this is something that politics is missing, and I take worldview from a religious point of view. And when I engage in apologetics on a religious basis, I think looking at people's worldviews is the best way to go. It's the lens through which people view the world. And I think too much we're too focused on attacking people at a political issue level. And I think it just becomes a cacophony of ideas of this is the best way, no, this is the best way, this is the best way. The positive issue that libertarians bring to the table is that we're ideologically based. The Democrats and the Republicans, you can say, oh, well, they're for this. Democrats are are pro-choice. They're pro-choice. Okay, well, can I have a semi-automatic rifle in California? Well, no. Oh, but you can get an abortion. Right, that's when we're pro-choice. We're not pro-choice in everything. Likewise, the government says, oh, we want small government and small taxes. Okay, so we can defund the military to a point where it accurately reflects the amount of threat that we have in the world today, as long as we're not fighting external wars, which we should never be involved in. Oh, well, no, we can't do that. We're the policemen of the world. So libertarians have an ideology that they adhere to, and they run everything through that worldview. And that's what makes the libertarian political ideology the best. It's because we have a consistent platform that we can draw to. So worldview is, again, this. Think about it like glasses. It's you look at something, a brute fact, and you observe it through your worldview. Everyone has one, and the goal is to live the most consistent within that worldview. When you have an inconsistency, that's the sign of a failed argument. An example that I can think of is, let's say that you have a belief that property is theft, which communism would believe that property is theft. Different types of socialistic ideologies would have this understanding that property itself is theft. Well, to live consistently would mean that you'd have to live in a communal system without private claim of anything, including the clothes on your back, the food that you eat, the children that you have. Those aren't able to be claimed to you. You're given to them by the state, and the community owns them in that way. You have no claim to your phone, your car, anything of physical value. You wouldn't fight against injustice of a central planner engaging in rationing or extortion because you don't believe in ownership. They're not extorting. They're not rationing people to subsistent levels, because the central planner, which is an understanding of this communal system, is the one that can divvy out property. You can't have a vested interest in it because there's no ability to obtain property for yourself. You may even live with the belief that you don't even own yourself, that the state can dictate what you do and live and work. The central planners are the ones that tell you that you need to be a factory worker, even if you want to be an artist. If you say, well, I want to be an artist, the state will come in and say, no, you're going to make rivets for the rest of your life for 30 years because you don't own your body. So because property is theft. Again, you yourself are your own property in what we'll discuss for the libertarian point of view. You're inconsistent because belief in this would lead to slavery, which is owning people by the state, which would be theft. So again, the worldview is property is theft. If you believe that, then you would understand that the state would have slaves because they would tell people what to do. And again, the state is just a collection of people. So people would own people. If that's the case, slavery is a form of property, which would be theft. So again, there's where you see the inconsistency within that worldview. You don't believe in property, slavery is property, therefore you're living inconsistently by saying property is theft because you couldn't live within that world. But let's look at it on the other hand. You believe that there's private property. You own yourself, you own the products of your labor, you own your children, your clothes, your car. When people or the state try and take those things, that's theft because you own it. There's no agreement to give it over. If there was, then it wouldn't be theft. When the state forces your property away from you with threat or violence, that's extortion. It's immoral. It's an immoral action. It should be an illegal action. So you can live consistently with that understanding. When interacting with people, you can drill down to their basic beliefs. You can figure out where they're coming from and look for inconsistencies. Again, this is something that I would do when dealing with someone who says that there are no absolutes, right? So we live in this postmodernist world. We have an understanding that what's true for you isn't always true for me. There are no absolutes. And then you ask, are you absolutely sure? If they say yes, then they would be living inconsistently with their ideology. If they say no, well then it defeats their own argumentation. So I think we miss this point a lot, and it's something that I want to research more from a personal level, is how do we bring worldview understanding into the libertarian ideology? Because yes, it's enough to say, I have this idea of how we can privatize roadways or waterways, or how we can have a private military or a private police force. Those issues are good to discuss. They're great to discuss. But I think if we drill down to a worldview level, we can show people where they're living inconsistently, and hopefully that will be a weapon that we can use to trigger people. Oh no, triggering. into understanding that when they want to steal from you, they're engaging in an immoral activity that lives inconsistently within their own ideology. When talking with someone, if you can figure out their worldview and what it is, that's when you can really figure out whose system works best. Again, you want to live the most consistently within your world as possible. Inconsistency is a sign of failed argument. So find which worldview makes more sense logically and rationally. And that's what the NAP brings, and that's what libertarian ideology has. Conversations don't always have to be you on the defensive. Sometimes it's not always, libertarians and a utopia system. What would you do with roads and military and the free rider problem and immigration? Well, if they're not giving you a likewise explanation of these things as well, where you can then drill down into what lens they're looking through, I think we're missing a step in there from a political standpoint. You don't always have to drive it back to God or a moral system. I think that might be the way to go. But I think it's an interesting point that I would like more people to consider when they're engaging in political thought. Any of that makes sense, Matt?
It makes sense to me.
Okay, good. Makes sense to you. It'll make sense to, well, I mean, I won't.
Hopefully, it makes sense to other reasonable people.
Yeah, exactly. Other reasonable people like us. All right, so what is the NAP? NAP is an acronym for non-aggression principle. It stems from the belief that initiation of physical violence is illegitimate. Violence can be against a person or a property as well. So if someone tells you, "Hey, give me your money," or I'll beat you up, they've engaged in both a violation of the non-aggression principle from the person, "I'll beat you up," and the property. There's a worldview belief in private property and the ability to engage in contract that comes from the belief in the natural law. A really good lecture that I have on this is from Judge Andrew Napolitano. You can find it on the Mises podcast site. I think it's called like "What Happened to the Constitution." He's just a master at the natural law. And I would direct people's attention to that for a better understanding of what the natural law is. That's something that we can also discuss later, but I just want to bring that up real quick. The non-aggression principle governs how people act in relation to each other. You live in a neighborhood. Your neighbor has a new car. You really like it. You don't go over and punch him in his face and take it and say, "This is mine now." It would be illegitimate. It would be theft. It would be possible extortion, depending on what you say. You can always give up your rights to property. You can sell it. You can engage in contracts. Think about jobs. I'm engaging in a contractual agreement between the person who's going to pay me now for the services that I offer. I think that's an interesting point when you look at what a job is, because I think people who don't believe in capitalism has this understanding of, well, you're being exploited because you're not gaining 100% of what they're making off of you. Yeah, but I don't have to wait 5, 6, 10 years for that profit to happen from the results of my labor. I can sell my body now, my time, for a price that I that I think is a good price, and I can get that payment in a week or two. I can get that payment immediately. You have legitimate prices that way. If you have an absence of a sales tax, you know that this widget, this loaf of bread, really costs $1. It doesn't cost $1.06. So having legitimate prices where and bread is taxed at each level. It's not just the final result product. You're paying taxes on the wheat and the machinery used to make it. It's the iPencil issue. There's so many things that get taxed along the process just to make a loaf of bread. It's insane that we even have money in the first place at the end of the day. Violations of the non-aggression principle would result in theft, assault, fraud, vandalism, pollution. I think is a good one. There's always this understanding of libertarians will just pollute the oceans and pollute the air, dump oil into the river. But if you have private property rights, you would say, well, this pollutant came over into my property and I didn't agree to it. So that person has engaged in aggression against me, and now I can take action against them through the use of lawsuit, or if it's a more deadly violation, you have the ability to engage in defensive activity of your life. So non-aggression doesn't say that you have to be a pacifist. You can engage in pacifism as you like because you're free to do so, but you can always take defensive action. That's why the Libertarian Party's mascot is a porcupine. Porcupine never shoots quills, but if it's attacked, it can put up its quills and be a defensive aggressor, I guess. I don't know if aggressor is the right word, but it can take defensive action into protecting itself. Violators would be violating the non-aggression principle. They give up their ability to life or their freedom or their property. if someone breaks into your house, takes a TV, and walks out with it, you're just as free to go back over and obtain your property back from them, fully justified. In the state system, you're prevented from doing that. You have to wait for the police. They might investigate. They might take fingerprints. They might not. And, you just make a claim to your insurance. There's no big deal. The fact that property crimes are so limitedly viewed from the police standpoint is ridiculous. The natural law or natural rights and liberty either come from our Creator or they come from our humanity. That's what kind of the natural law states. So you either own yourself, your body, the products of your labor because you were made in the image of God, and your personhood allows you to have those rights, or they're a product based on you being born as a logical creature who has the ability to recognize and understand that you own yourself and the products of your labor. So it can be a divine creator aspect, or it can just be a naturally imbued one. I think if you're still looking at it from a worldview situation, I think you could have arguments against those two, but you can make the claim at least to a basic level to launch from a worldview standpoint. To say that it comes from the state, that property comes from the state, it begs the question and has a misunderstanding. Thomas More, when he was being accused, asked, "Can an act of Parliament declare that the Earth is flat when it is round?" Well, of course not, right? Just because the state makes a claim that you should believe in something, that they have a right to something, that they give you something, doesn't make it true, especially if it says the opposite of what it is. The state can say you don't have the freedom of speech just because they have the ability to say that and enforce it. Doesn't mean you don't have the ability to have free speech. Within libertarian thought, a lot of examples tend to come from Robinson Crusoe, and I never really understood why. Robinson Crusoe lands at a desert island, has to survive, and how does he do so? What's the best way to do it? And I never really understood why they used Robinson Crusoe so much, except that Robinson Crusoe is devoid of the state on the island. So what does Robinson Crusoe, what's he able to engage in? Well, he owns himself, and he owns the property that he can gather. So if he gathers a coconut, the coconut's his. Once Friday comes along, Friday gathers berries. He can engage in trade between Friday and him for coconuts for berries. If he hits Friday over the head with a coconut, he's engaged in aggression, and we would say that that's immoral and should be illegal, and that aggression, he's satisfied an immediate concern. He wanted those berries, he got those berries, but now he's ruined a relationship of engaging in the best way to interact with Friday, which is through non-aggression. He trades a coconut for a handful of berries because he's got 2 other coconuts at home. He's benefited from that because he wanted those berries over the coconut, and Friday wanted the coconut over the berries because he's got bushels of it back at his place. We see that in the Constitution. It's Congress shall make no law violating the free speech of people. It's the word "the" that shows you that it's a recognition that there is already a natural right to free speech. You don't. The First Amendment doesn't say that the government grants the people an ability to freedom of speech except under these circumstances. It's a recognition that it's already imbued in you as a person, and then from there they try and curtail it, especially within the past number of years. The non-aggression principle comes into play when someone else shows up on your deserted island, and we see that with our Friday example. We own our own bodies, our own thoughts, our own ideas, our own words, and we own the product of our labor. and most would agree that people should be held responsible for their actions towards ideas and what our property does. If you're going to be held responsible, that means it's part of ownership. We don't say that, I don't really own my own body. It's owned by the community, and when I rape that person, I can't be held responsible, because holding someone responsible means that you had the ability to control that, which is you. Or, if you have your car and it leaks oil into your neighbor's yard, you don't say, well, I don't really own this vehicle, so you can't hold me responsible for the damage that happened to the property, or that got you sick, because first of all, I don't believe you even own yourself, but I don't own this car. If it's innate in the car, well, bad car, bad. But go to the community and find regress from there. But you shouldn't, because you don't even own the property that the oil spilled out on. So that's where libertarian idea, bringing in the nap and having that as our worldview, the lens that we look at things through, and we see that that's the best way that we can engage in political discussion. It's the way we best engage in economic discussion and action. And so the nap is legitimately the best way that we can have the benefit, the greatest possible benefit in this world. I think, Matt, you have the history of the nap.
Yeah. One thing, I found an interesting quote from Thomas Jefferson about that they pulled in for the non-aggression principle. It was in 1816. He said to Francis Gilmer, "Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual. And no man has a natural right to commit aggression on the equal rights of another, and this is from which laws ought to restrain him." I thought that was interesting, because, how he adds in, he doesn't add in the limits of the law, because laws can be, corrupted and brought on by the state that aren't really, that go against the natural rights.
Right, protectionism.
Yeah.
The government doesn't allow you to sue vaccine manufacturers for any adverse reactions to any vaccine. I'm not talking about never vaccinate your children because it'll give you autism. I'm just saying, if you have a bad batch of the vaccine and something happens to your kid, you are prohibited from taking economic action against them, because the government says no, no, no.
Yeah.
We find the non-aggression principle too in not just quotes from political figures, but we see it in a lot of religious system. In Judeo-Christian, it's the golden rule. Don't do violence to you unless if it's, don't engage in activity that you wouldn't want done to you. You want violence done to you. But then at the same time, there's a redress, which is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. There's a sense of justice that comes about because especially in the Bible, an understanding of private property exists in a natural state to humans. In the Garden of Eden, God gave Adam and Eve the garden, turned it over to them, and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and tame the garden and expand it out." Well, how do you do that if you don't own it? You're being given ownership. You're being given responsibility. The product of the labor would result from the work. So ownership would increase as Adam and Eve being the first homesteaders.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. I didn't really know until I looked more into it. But for the history that, you've got things for the non-aggression principle dating all the way back to 300 BC by what's his name, Epicurus. There's a quote from him saying, "Natural justice is a symbol or expression of usefulness to prevent one person from harming or being harmed by another."
Mm-hmm.
So you've got bits of non-aggression principle that have been in, civilization for a very long time.
Right. Well, because it only makes sense because we're a social creature. We engage in social activity. That's how we learn and grow and get wealthier. Look at the trial of Socrates that Plato wrote about. At the very beginning, Socrates is engaging in public debate with someone over what is piety. Socrates isn't, cutting off this guy's toes and telling him to agree to him with what he believes piety is. He's engaging in a rational discussion because he's trying to get to the best possible outcome between those two people. When you engage in aggression, it's this what we see in movies. I'll rule through fear. Well, yeah, you can rule through fear until everyone rises up against you and overthrows you because the mob outnumbers you as an elite. But if you engage in non-aggression and convince people and don't take their stuff, they're more likely to work with you. So if you're living next to your neighbor and they want to put up a big fence, and you're like, oh well, I really like looking at the trees over the fence. Hey, can we work out a system where you make it 3 feet instead of 6 feet? And they might say, no, I won't do that. And you're like, well, can I pay you $100 to do it? Well, that might be enough to engage in it. Or, if it obstructs your view, what is it harming you? Right? It's obscuring your view of the nice trees over on the other side. But he's not aggressing against you upon it. You may be disappointed, but an understanding that we live communally, socially, I'm talking about, not economically, is an understanding that we had the best possible outcome. He didn't agree to it, and we didn't engage in violence, and we're still neighbors. I'm going to go over and take a pie to him and say, hey, no hard feelings. Or he's going to do it, maybe without you paying $100 to him. And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm just using the fence so that my dog doesn't get out. So 3 feet rather than 6 feet means less material for me. And a relationship forms. And that's why on a local level, the non-aggression principle works so much better because you're actively engaged in the system around you. When you punt it off to the federal level, or what we did when we fought the Revolutionary War for, it's those people that look back across, from Washington D.C. to California is a long way. So the ability to engage in going to that person and directly speaking to them decreases the value of engaging in a discussion. So it's more easy for them to say, oh, we can take your stuff, your money, your property, whenever we want. And it's interesting that it's the federal government that does that more than local governments. It still happens on a local government level, but federal seems to take more things away than the states or the local.
For sure.
Anything else?
I mean, that about sums. I think that's a good dive into the NAP in the beginning.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, we're not covering the subject super completely. We want to give a general overview of what the non-aggression principle is, and I mean, what's the local application? We always want to talk about what can we do locally. Well, don't steal your neighbor's property, but engage in trade and borrowing. We do that all the time. Hey, can I borrow a screwdriver? We had a typical middle-aged dad party over here where we got our mowers together, and one guy had a blade grinder, and he grinded our blades for us. And we just had a good time doing that. We were all in, khaki shorts, and I don't think any of us were wearing socks and sandals, but it was definitely fun. And then when my neighbor goes out of town, I bring his garbage back from the end of the curb. I mean, that's what a majority of our relationships are. We don't always want to engage in aggression. If we did, we'd be the mob or the government, because there's really no difference. The government says, do this or else. The mob says, do this or else. There's the only thing that makes the government slightly more legitimate, and I'm using the term legitimate very loosely, is that there are a certain number of people who agree to that system, and it's always been in place, so it's hard to question it. It's Plato's on the wall. You see the shadows dancing on the wall. Well, that's what the truth is. There's definitely nothing behind you to look at, because you've always noticed that. And so when someone gets out and walks around and says, hey, these are just, little stick figures, these aren't real things, it's really hard for people to take that understanding, because that's all they know. You can do what you want to your house. We see that. You pick your carpeting, you decide to finish your basement, you do put a new roof on, or not. Hey, I like my little crappy roof, or I don't have funds for it. But yet, when the government says, oh, you need a permit to finish your basement, or hey, your roof's really bad, we're going to come and fine you if you don't have this. they're the ones that engage in aggression. They're the ones that are violating your rights. Just because you happen to live in that area, that's your consent, is what they say, and that's just not the case. Because like, oh well, the typical liberal understanding of, oh, just because she's wearing a short skirt doesn't mean that she she was asking to get raped. Oh well, you were just in a bad neighborhood, so you were just, you agreed to it by being in that in Rape Street. So what do you expect? Rape Street would be a great name to keep people out of, I would think. That's what I should do. Yeah, come on down.
Your street.
Hey, pizza guy.
Just name your own street Rape Street, and then no one will bother you.
There you go. Hey, pizza guy, can you deliver to 123 Rape Street? No, definitely not. If we don't allow people to use very small things without our permission, then why are big things in such contention? It's my money, it's my property, it's my vehicle. I don't let people just come in and like, oh, someone just took my vehicle. I guess that's fine. But we let the government do this. We need to understand that unless if we're giving consent, unless if it's like, well, the money that they're taking, I would freely give to a private charity to do the same thing, right? That's one thing. But they're doing it at the force of a gun. And just because they do something nice with it doesn't mean anything. If I came up to you and stuck a gun in your face and said, give me your money, I'm going to go feed the homeless with it in your name, and I'll let everyone know. Well, you've still engaged in violence. It's still illegitimate. You've engaged in theft. Just because you do something nice with it, just because you've given me credit for it, or just because I've given you credit for it, doesn't mean it's not an act of aggression. What I think this does too, it actually, for me, it instills a greater desire to engage in voluntary interaction with my neighbors and limit fighting. Because, okay, I know I can't do violence against them, but I can definitely be nicer to them because I have this understanding that they might not like me coming in their face and yelling at them for, don't paint your house pink, that looks ugly, that's going to keep my property values down. Well, there's no act of aggression there. First of all, you're not owed property value. Your property is worth whatever someone's going to pay. And just because you don't like the look of it doesn't mean that it's an act of aggression upon you. But if I have my neighbor and he says, oh yeah, I'm going to paint my house bright pink because I think the airplanes flying overhead will like it. Well, if I engage in a rational discussion with that person, maybe I can change it and say, hey, how about this nice green color, or let him know that airplanes can't see his house from this flight path. I think the non-aggression principle, especially for libertarians, we have the ability to engage in a better relational conversation with people than other people, because there's always the idea of, hey, give to private charities to fund birth control for underage kids that can't afford it, rather than, hey, go to the next state over, smash in that person's house, grab their money before it enters their bank account, bring it back and give it to the poor kids who are wanting to not get knocked up for engaging in risky sexual behavior. I mean, one is legitimately more peaceful, it's more moral, and it's something that we constantly engage in as just normal people. And that's what we are. We're normal people. If you can't use force, then maybe I make a better argument or pay the person, which is not a bribe, but you're just exchanging your money for a desired outcome, which happens all the time. I want that loaf of bread. The store wants my money. I give them the money that they want. I get the bread. We've exchanged in detail. In holy matrimony of capitalistic competition. A violation in contract could lead to a lawsuit, and you don't need the state to carry out a lawsuit. You can have private courts. You can have arbitration, which happens all the time. If you have a dispute with your neighbor, and you live on a private street, you may have a good HOA, not one of those bad ones that Matt always likes bringing up. But there's an arbitration. So there you've engaged in a contract that said, I agree to abide by the arbitration of the tribunal, or whatever you might call it, and you abide by the outcome of that. You've engaged into a contract with that, and you've followed the recourse of that contract. none of this has to have the state involved. We can do this on a local level, and I think that's the biggest thing that we want to bring about in this podcast is let's not look to the federal because they're already lost. They're already stealing from us. There are other people that are doing a lot more for the top level. We want to talk about a local level. When it comes to stadiums being built, we have a greater availability to say no. When it comes to the poisoning of our water, we have a greater ability to ask for the state to get out and for private companies to get in. When we live in neighborhoods, we engage in nonviolent activity because we're always going to live next to that neighbor, and we want to be nice so that we can foster a good sense of calm and peace in the neighborhood that we are always that we live a majority of our day out on. The same thing why you should, not have aggression and punch your coworkers is because, well, as long as you don't get fired, you're going to continue to interact with them. You want them to do stuff for you. They want you to carry out your job. The non-aggression principle as a worldview makes us more consistent people because that's how we already do act. A lot of us do act in non-aggressive ways. Even the violent dictators have to engage in non-aggressive ways in order to get what they want out because we're social people who engage in social activity. Anything else that we might have missed, Matt?
Not that I can think of right now.
Yeah, I think this is a good episode for introduction into the non-aggression principle. What we're going to do next episode is we're going to look at specific issues that the non-aggression principle can inform us on what to do. Drugs, property, wars, immigration, whatever we might come up with that we want to look at to say how does this issue, how can we look at this issue consistently with the worldview of the non-aggression principle. And there's a good article that we can go through that has objections to the non-aggression principle that I think is going to make for a really good discussion. All right, so that's it for this episode 2. We'll see you next week, and I just want to encourage everyone to live radically, because by living radically, we only have this one life to live, and to live it for the state or for people that want to do violence to you is not worth it. So get out there and live radically. Have a good day.